So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about how this book came to be. When Michael Browne was killed in Ferguson, Missouri, 10 years ago almost, a lot of women were online talking about his death and these kinds of deaths and how we feel about them, particularly as Black mothers. And in this dialogue across social media and some hard media, we're going to have to fix that. We all were talking, and among the people who was monitoring these conversations or heard parts of them was Marie Browne. And at some point, she and I got to talking about how we could capture all these wonderful voices in some sort of book. And she suggested that I write a proposal for an anthology, which I did. And I got something like 20 some writers back then to commit to the project. And at least 3 of them gave me full essays for the book, or for the proposal. And others wrote a summary of what they would write. And I suggested some pieces we might buy reprint permissions for. Marie shopped that book diligently around New York, and the publishing world was not interested in hearing this yet. I think it's the nicest way of saying it. So I put the proposal away, and I didn't even think about it for years until George Floyd was killed the day after my birthday in 2020. And the same kinds of conversations were coming up. So I sat down and rewrote the proposal. I didn't even tell Maria I was going to attempt it, but it was the middle of the pandemic and I had nothing better to do. So this time around, I got 35 writers or pieces that I proposed to buy. I wrote my own essay, which I had not done before, which was to be about raising. First of all, I adopted 4 sons with this lovely man over here, and 2 of them have special needs. And mine is particularly about how scary it is when your child, one, can't communicate and doesn't understand danger. What I say is that with those 2 children with special needs, we can't even have what we've come to call the talk with them because we don't think they understand, or they can't tell us, yes, mommy, I understand. So that's a danger. And then, my sons have become 6 feet tall Black men walking around in America. Yes. I can't even leave one of them sitting in the car outside the drugstore, because if they were approached by police, one can't really talk at all, and the other would be babbling, and the police would think something was really wrong with him, which there is. But in the course of writing mine, I also discovered that disabled people and disabled Black men are the most likely to come in contact with the police and the most likely to get shot. So that did not make me feel well. But I have 2 other writers in the book. The book is organized in themes, and mine is one called Special Circumstances. One writer writes about her son who was high functioning enough to go to college. It happens to be my alma mater, Marshall University in West Virginia, has a program for people with autism. And he is from DC. Another woman is a professor, wrote about her son had been missing for 24 hours at State College, PA. Then he was found back in his apartment, and police shot him within minutes of getting in that apartment. We don't know what happened, but there's that kind of danger. In any rate, when I rewrote this proposal and called Marie and said, are you interested in shopping it? She said, yes. And I said, do you think it'll sell? She said, now it'll sell, because now they know what we're talking about. And sure enough, almost immediately, Adrian suggested that Broadleaf Books take a look at the proposal, and they bought it. So I've spent the last couple of years actually putting this together, which was like herding cats, of course. People would promise me an essay, and then they would ghost me for months. Other people came through that I didn't even think I could get some of these people, but I did. And a lot of the pieces we bought are excellent. So I hope you'll enjoy reading them. That said, I think we can get into the readings. So let's go in alphabetical order. Gloria.
And my piece is based on the fact that I delve deeply into legal history. So I was looking at not just the effect Michael Brown's death had on me on murder, because I'm laughing at Brown and my brother's name is Michael. And I had been in Ferguson, Missouri, grew up in the Midwest, have been in New York for some time. So all of those things rang with me. And I do commentary for CNN, MSNBC, other entities like that. And it was on those commentaries that I was asked, well, do you think it's just a need for more training? And to go on air and have to be objective, so many things are going on that are hitting me personally. It's very difficult. And I thank you for giving me an outlet to say what I wanted to say. That many times, even though I get very close to the edge, I try to not go into any type of rant on a news program. And this to me is not so much a rant as it is a studied legal analysis of history. It's titled, Why They Kill Us. Why do they kill us? I wonder why white men with a badge kill Black people with impunity, especially our Black men. Perhaps it is because too many in law enforcement come from an America where their white brothers are able to hold a murder weapon, warm from shooting as many people as possible in the streets, movie theaters, home, church, synagogue, restaurant, business, protest march, and then sashay away anyway, unscathed. But our unarmed Black men are a living threat in need of killing. Yes, police will apprehend the white culprit eventually. Maybe even take him for a burger on the way to jail. Mass murdering makes for hungry work. This white suspect will live to stand before a judge and plead not guilty. He will be alive to serve out a prison sentence, dying only by his own hand or of old age. His depravity represents his individual sick self, rarely his family, never his race. Why do they kill us? We are competition. We were competition as Africans in the Virginia colony in 1619. Africans raised from the hold of a slave ship that had been attacked on the high seas, kidnapped Angolan men, women, and children arriving as strangers in a strange land, but able within a few years to learn the language, economy, religion, and society. They put a foothold into the economy and began to compete intellectually and agriculturally. They were enslaved or indentured servants, among them Marion Anthony Johnson, and perhaps other unrecorded Africans who figured it all out. Figured it out in Jamestown settlement within the Virginia colony. These Africans began to succeed in an English colony founded in 1607 that within a few years of its birth devolved into cannibalism. Africans shamed the Europeans with their resilience and their progress. Why do they kill us? They kill us out of greed and avarice. This is a colony where the hierarchy of the English high class was at the top and the working white indentured servants, some called even white slaves, at the bottom, sitting in place. Why do they kill us? Centuries of habit have numbed them. An intertwining baseness of law, power, violence, and greed, where no measure is too malevolent to undermine the capacity of Africans to compete and perhaps excel against Europeans. We are a threat to the building of empire. Why do they kill us? They kill us because God has blessed this land called the United States of America with abundance, allowing some to believe that this is a holy land and no holy punishment for these sins will take place. Why do they kill us? They kill our Black men because undereducation, underemployment, poor medical care, constant harassment, poisoned water, and the system of criminal injustice do not reduce the African population quickly enough. Why do they kill us? They have been murdering Africans for a long time with no criminal consequences. As early as 1669, the legislative body of Virginia created a law to allow Europeans to kill Africans without being charged with a felony. It was not enough to put Africans in bondage for life. Europeans were given control over African life and death. Without laws to charge or society to protect, hell's gates were opened against Black people
by white Christians. Why do they kill us? They kill us because they can. Over 1,000 American citizens die at the hands of police every year, most of them African Americans. Police can claim fear for their lives without testimony or jury verdict to confirm it. Prosecutors work hand in glove with law enforcement and find no worthy evidence or trial strategy. Why do they kill us? They kill us to maintain an artificial white supremacy that is unsustainable without murder. Why do they kill us? Envy is one of those 7 deadly sins. There is a jealousy and envy inherent in watching oppressed people rise from oppression, especially when they have been hunted with guns, bullets, and shooting lessons paid by government tax dollars. African Americans refuse to play the role of captured people, allowing oppressors to gloat. Instead, we must accept our power. We need to see ourselves as the competition white people believe us to be.
Thank you. First, I would like to acknowledge Marie Browne, my first agent 32 years ago. It's lovely to see you still on the case. I have a background as a magazine editor. I have been an avid follower of media, in particular, how we are portrayed in the media. So when Angela approached me about what portion of the anthology I would like to deal with, I took on the media. It was beginning of the playoffs for the Super Bowl 57. Oh, just kidding. Thank you. Which coincided with the murder of Tyre Nichols. So the piece I wrote is called Let's Go to the Videotape. During the month of January 2023, the frenzy surrounding Super Bowl 57 with 2 Black quarterbacks set to face off in an historic game was matched only by the frenzy surrounding the anticipated release of a videotape showing the horrific killing of a 29-year-old Black man, Tyre Nichols, by 5 Memphis police officers. The first match was a televised football event. The second match was a televised killing event. What was most disturbing about the Tyre Nichols killing, coming as it did right in the middle of the 2023 playoffs for America's most popular sports event, the colossal Super Bowl, was its own latent entertainment value, soon turned into a powerful police beatdown reality show. Yes, the Memphis police chief, a Black woman, was impressive in her swiftness to denounce the beating and subsequent death of Nichols and fire the policeman accused of the beating. More drama unfolded as more heads rolled. A fireman and 2 EMT workers who were at the scene and did nothing to stop the beating or assist the beaten victim were fired. A day after the beating, the police chief, in an interview with CNN's Don Lemon on January 8th, 2023, made the announcement that would elevate a heinous crime to the platform of prurient entertainment. On January 17, 4 videotapes of the beating would be released for viewing by America's consuming public. The tapes were graphic, the chief warned, had sickened her, she said, and yet the videos rolled. A week after Tyre Nichols died at 7 p.m. that day, as promised, all the networks and the cable stations that wanted to air the killing of Nichols by the Black, thug-like, gang-style Scorpion unit of Memphis's finest were free to do so, compliments of the Memphis Police Department. In short order, following the advertised hype for the upcoming beating, social media lit up with rants and ruminations over whether Black people should watch. Didn't such errands perpetrate too much tragic racial trauma to be viewed by America's Black folk? We who have lived through rampant brutality, police and otherwise, for over 400 years, did we really need to be reminded of America's many institutional travesties? I was one of those who chose to watch, not because I gave any benefit of doubt to policemen whose first instinct too often is to draw tasers or guns and shoot when confronting a Black man. I still remember that day nearly 30 years ago when I took my son, then 11, and my nephew, 9, into Times Square by subway train. Excited, they dashed off the train as soon as it pulled into the station, skinny legs popping out of khaki shorts, their two big baseball caps turned backward, running like the adrenaline-filled little boys they were. They rushed up the stairs, flying past a young, short, white cop, standing at the top of the stairs on patrol alone. As soon as the cop saw the 2 Black boys rushing past him, he immediately and instinctively put his hand on his gun, ready to draw it. I was close enough to the boys to yell, "Hey guys, chill." And close enough to the cop to look him in the eye as he put his trigger-ready hand down once he saw and heard me tell my children to slow down. They're little boys doing what little boys do. They run. I hissed at him. The cop said nothing. So no, I did not need to be reminded of the many travesties embedded within America's wall, crawling with police officers, both Black and white, who are charged with law enforcement, yet too many times break the law. And as I had personally observed, too often too ready to gun down Black males of any age, knowing their police badges will protect them within a system structured to justify the killing of Black males, be they grown men or little boys. I watched the videotapes of the Tyre Nichols beating because they represented the latest continuing travesty in American law enforcement. The beating and killing of Black men by police displayed in all the gory detail of popular American media. A dangerous development needing to be watched and called out. Videotaped killings of Black men by police have become not only routine in the violence shown, but the more vicious ones like George Floyd or Tyre Nichols can elicit the kind of salacious thrills known to accompany the viewing of extreme acts of violence. Not unlike the frenzy of those screaming masses of Romans of all colors and classes who would roar with delight and loved nothing better than watching gladiators slaughter slaves in the Colosseum, bloodied heads severed from the body and rolling in the dust. Watching Black men on video being beaten, tased, bloodied, and crying out for their mothers in a last gasp of life is now the modern day equivalent of ancient bloodlust. And lusting for the blood of Black men is as old as America's history.
Thank you. Great.
Can you hear me? Do I leave from here? No. It's a little closer. How's that? Yeah, thank you. So I want to first thank Angela Dodson for giving me an opportunity to share this. It was interesting because I've been wanting to tell my story. I've been working on a professional memoir for years, and part of what I wanted to do was to share what it is like to raise Black sons. And I had an opportunity over the years at different programs to talk about, well, how did you do it? Your sons are successful. Given this environment, what did you do in terms of raising Black sons? So I'm going to share something more personal that related to what my husband and I do. That's my husband and I, we strongly believe that our sons should be surrounded by role models who affirm their identity and who instilled self-confidence, and with an educational environment that emphasized knowledge of self and culture. Thus, their first school was Weusi Shule, an African-centered school in Brooklyn. And their second was Junior Academy, a private educational school for Black children. Our sons felt comfortable in their own skin in these schools. They were among other young children who had Afrocentric names and felt included. The importance of this supportive and nurturing environment was underscored when they were introduced to an integrated environment in the first and second grade. Talib and Jamal came home and told us that they wanted to change their names to Peter and Jason. It was clear to us that they wanted to feel more included in their new school environment. Because we had deliberately chosen their names to reflect our worldview, that their names be connected to their culture and heritage, we informed them of this significance and told them that if they wanted to change their name, once they became an adult, they could do so. Talib and Jamal never came back to us about the name change. And unlike many hip hop artists, Talib Kweli decided to keep his given name, which means student and seeker of truth and knowledge. We live in a society constructed by race, and despite what we do to protect our sons from experiences that target and stereotype them, we cannot prevent them from being targets of discrimination and racism. These experiences cut across class, and I became acutely aware of the discriminatory and racist situations they encountered. I was the mother of a hip hop artist who had begun touring while he was in his late teens. By the time his album, Mos Def and Talib Kweli or Black Star was released in 1998, he had been on the road with his music for several years. In his early adult years, I always learned to pick up the phone and to accept calls, no matter the time of night. One incident that stands out is when Talib and his partner, High Tech, were arrested in Cincinnati, Ohio, after neighbors called the police because they were playing the music too loudly while sitting on the stoop. When the police came, arguments ensued, and both were taken to the precinct, supposedly for resisting arrest. Talib, having been raised in New York City, knew that any perceived resistance to the police could result in more charges or in some form of police brutality. He used logic, Talib, that's what he would do, and began a monologue informing the police that he and his partner were not criminals and that their time could be better spent arresting the real criminals. This did not persuade them, and he ended up in jail. When I got the call that night, my husband and I called on lawyers we knew and immediately began the 11-hour drive to Cincinnati. We wanted to be sure to be in the courtroom when Talib's case was presented to the judge. Talib was a student at New York University during this time. Our appearance, along with the fact that we, two professors, had obtained a lawyer, was instrumental in having the case dismissed on the spot. As parents, we know that Black men wear a badge that they cannot deny. The backlash received by men with Arabic names has exacerbated the situation. When Talib, whose name has Arabic origins, traveled right after 9/11, he often received second looks when he told flight receptionists or attendants his name. He recounted how a song by Stokely Carmichael was playing in the background while he was making flight reservations one day. When he got to the airport, he was not able to access his boarding pass, and the security officers were called. They took him into an office and thoroughly searched his luggage. The song had prompted the airline reservationist to target him. My son Jamal, whose name also has Arabic roots, recounted how when traveling to Israel with a group of other lawyers, he was signaled out by the Israelis who wanted to know why his parents chose that name. His bags were thoroughly searched. The fear in these situations is that we never know when the singling out of our sons as a result of racial profiling can take a wrong turn. We know of too many who end up in prison or abused because a person in authority overreacted to the situation. We live with the reality of these fears. When Dr. Henry Louis Gates, a distinguished college professor, can be arrested and accused of breaking into his own home, you know that we as a nation are in serious trouble. What can we do as parents and as educators and leaders to ensure the survival of our young men? I am concerned about my male grandchildren, for I know that despite the best efforts of their parents to protect them, they may be subjected to racial profiling. I have been reluctant to sit on juries involving the offenses of Black men because I don't entirely trust the system and the treatment of Black people, especially boys and men. Yet we need to have a presence on juries for accountability reasons. Like many Black mothers across this nation, I was heartened when both of my sons turned 21. They had defied the statistics, but we know that their confrontation with law enforcement can happen at any age. Where do we go from here? How do we address the killing of Black men? As mothers, we have a lifetime of stories that we should continue to tell so that we can collectively resist and so that our sons will be remembered. We have stories that can help others to cope and to survive. Our stories can offer solutions to the challenges and dilemmas as they help us to conquer fear and to cope with pain as well as with joy. Thank you.
I'm going to ask some general questions for that I want each of you to answer, and then some specific to your piece. First of all, why did you agree to be part of this project? You, Brenda.
Oh, Brenda. As I said, this was something that I wanted to do. Many years ago, I had an opportunity to participate in a series of programs where me, the mother of Talib Kweli, Sharon, the mother of Mos Def, and I'm remembering her name, the mother of Common. We all toured together to talk to other parents and educators and the community about what are the strategies we have for raising Black men. And in fact, somebody wanted to do a book on it, and we just never got around to doing it. So in a way, this is an extension of that. It's an opportunity to tell our story and to emphasize the importance of, yes, we have fear because of the way that they are perceived, but there's some strategies we have. We have to use the community. So that's one way. Okay.
Gloria?
Thank you so much. I was in the middle of writing 2 books when this came across the desk, and I just jumped on it. I think I said yes that day.
I think you did.
Yeah. And because one thing I had not heard, talking about strategies, one thing I had not heard was why. I was on an NPR radio station doing an interview when they opened up the program up to listeners, and it sounded like a white male listener, and he said he was a white male. said that they killed you because they can, and no amount of training is going to get that to stop. And so once I heard that from him, I started to think, and the killing is based on how far. And so I like the history. I go back 400 years, 500 years if necessary. And then I realized, if you can imagine people who have been sent across the ocean by King James to start this colony. The first one fails, the Roanoke colony. The second one then continues. And they did delve into cannibalism in the Jamestown settlement. These Africans arrive and begin to thrive. And tobacco is the crop, and they know agriculture. So here are these people who are supposed to be lesser than by God, by society, by law, who are besting them. And so my concern is around strategy was to be able to actually articulate, we are competition, and I don't hear that. And this is something, once I think in a point of empowerment, of cultural pride, of our understanding of our role here, because many times they ask, why don't you just leave us alone? Even during segregation, they would come into our communities. Even now, come from the suburbs into urban areas. Why? And so this idea of our competition is something that when I had this opportunity to say, it doesn't have to be a law review article, it doesn't have to be a full book, it's going to be a manageable piece. And you actually said you wanted shorter pieces. So to be able to write this manageable small piece that gets to a point that I don't hear, that needs to be discussed and now will be out there as part of the intellectual marketplace of ideas. I just thought that was such a great opportunity. And I thank you so much for allowing me to do it.
Thank you. She's one of the people that I thought, I will never get her. I don't know her. She doesn't know me. She's not going to do this, but somebody introduced us. And I was able to get to her. And I'm so glad you did. Audrey?
Well, Angela, I know you. And I knew you told me if I said no. No, you happened to reach out to me at a point, and Angela knows my story. I'm one of those people who left the country when Trump was elected president. Mm-hmm. Now, I've been going back and forth, but I basically had given up on America. So at the point that you reached out, Angela, the Super Bowl was happening, about to happen. And I tell people I don't follow sports, but I follow the politics of sports. Mm-hmm. So what was happening with the Super Bowl was two Black gladiators were facing off against each other. Don't even remember the brothers' names, but two Black quarterbacks were going to the Super Bowl. At the same time, the Tyree Nichols had been killed. And a videotape of the killing was going to be shown. So that's the point, pretty much when you contact me. And I don't know if it had already, well, I think it had already happened.
I think it had.
It had already happened. And I am so mindful of how the media portrays Black folk, women, men, children. And I just thought the real travesty was in treating this young man's death like a sporting event. Mm. And his mother, who really just tore at my heart. Every time you saw her, she looked like she was literally falling apart. Mm-hmm. And the cameras would be in her face. How do you feel? Mm-hmm. There was no respect for her grief. Mm-hmm. There was no giving her privacy to mourn the loss of her child. So I really, and that's in the essay, I talk about all that, and I talk about a lot of things. And I'm a magazine writer, and essay is my favorite form of writing. So having the opportunity to work with Angela, who I have to say is a masterful editor.
Yes.
She really is. I mean, she made me the good what all editors do, which is make you better. So I appreciate that. And I have to say, I was on her, I didn't get a book, and I started reading the essays. And I gotta tell you, I've alternated between being in tears and being enraged. changed.
Yes.
And this is such an important work. It's so important to hear, read the diverse voices of all of us, women in particular, who have been affected by how our men are treated,
Yes.
whether we're mothers, wives, aunties, grandmothers. It is the one thing that unites us all.
Okay.
So thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Your check will be in the mail.
Another one?
Which is a good segue into my next question for each of you. If you've had a chance to read some of the other essays, I gather you have, what is something you learned from somebody else's essay or felt that you got out of somebody else's? Anybody?
I'll start. Of course, the first two essays I read were my fellow sister.
Panelists, so you know what they're talking about.
Yeah. And when I read yours, Brenda, thank you. I was really, well, Brenda is the mother of Talib Kweli. Talib Kweli is someone I interviewed when I was doing a piece for Vibe magazine. Did not know who this brother was, knew he was a rapper. Don't remember what the piece was. I'm an oldie and they wanted me to write about rap as an oldie. So I call him up and he gets on the phone and the first thing, and I identified myself and he said, "Oh, I know your work." I said, "You do?" And I'm thinking, okay, maybe he's lying, but he's so so what impressed me with your piece, Brenda, were your prescriptions for what you did as a parent. Right. And the fact that you are Kweli's mother, and I think I said in my note to you, I can see where he came from. And you had the resources, you and your husband had the resources, which you talk about. So many of Black parents do not.
Yes.
So to me, it was so instructive and helpful to see what you did concretely to raise your two boys for the men that they are today.
Thank you.
Brenda's is part of a whole section on education, and I think that section proves it. We're not just here to blame the police or society for our problems. We take great care in preparing our sons and trying to get them educated. As I described it, your son went from public school to private boarding school.
Right.
My kids went from Catholic school, Quaker school. We did military school one summer. So, we sent them to the finest camps there were, that kind of thing. So what I want you to talk about, you talked about the village. Who was your village when you were raising your sons?
My village consisted of more of my colleagues and friends. I was active in a couple of organizations, minority political women, women's business and professional women's, but I was also very involved in my professional organizations, the National Council of Teachers of English, and my colleagues at work. And so when I began to see the challenges, I called on every male person I knew to talk to, particularly Talib, because he was the most challenging. And I didn't realize how full I was until I went to a conference one year and people started asking me, "Well, how's your son doing?" Because I would talk about this. It was so full. I felt we were doing everything we could to ensure that he would do well, but the system and the environment was more important than what we could do. You know, we did the beginning surrounding them with making sure they had a strong sense of self. And I think that was really important, so that the philosophy was wherever they landed, they had a place to come back to. And that's what happened. They had a place to come back to. But I remember Talib saying, he talked to so many of my colleagues. You know, I just said, just other males, not only his father, but other males. And just being and the sports helped a lot too. My husband was their coach, you know, for baseball, and that helped a lot. And I think making sure that we always made sure, and in particular, that they did things together as a team. You know, as a team, going fishing together, you know, going camping, all of those things. So even though they came, we were faced with challenges of him wanting to break out, they had that space to go back to. And I think both of them understand now the importance of family and the importance of the village. And that's one of the things I have to say, you cannot do this by yourself. And you can't be embarrassed or try to hide it. There's a reason we're social people. You know, there's a reason that we're social, and just be able to share. I just want to emphasize that. I had friends who said, well, I did all I can, you know, I raised him as on his own, you know, I'm gonna let him go. I said, no, never give up on your sons, on your daughters. Never give up, no matter what.
Gloria, you give us a lot of historical perspective, and you talk about the agonizing fear of the black body, and you already mentioned competition. How are we competition today, and why are we still targets today?
Because we're as much competition today as we were 400 years ago. And I think about, here's one quick example, and I always like to bring in Queen Nzinga. Queen Nzinga, who was born in 1583, died in 1663, negotiated a peace treaty with the Portuguese in 1622. So most people who were looking at the 400th commemoration of the African arrival in 2019, if they traveled to Ghana, they might have traveled to Nigeria, traveled to Senegal, but we need to look at Angola because those 29 Africans were from Angola. This fierce Queen Nzinga is someone who fought the Portuguese and lived until she was 80 years old. They never captured her, they never fought her. She was so feared, they built statues in her honor because she was so feared, she was revered. And yet most people don't know who she was. And this is how powerful we were back then. Then you take that same DNA and have us navigate every system of diabolical evil you can imagine, from breeding Black women in order to produce babies to be sold or used as labor, from hanging people by their feet to burning people alive to cutting off people. This country is horrendous when it comes to racial history. And yet here we are sitting here. This is something that is so amazing that our very existence reminds people of their past. It's the reason why we have book bannings right now. It's the reason why there's so much we don't want to know. They don't want to know in this country what they've done because Sankofa means that you've got to deal with your past in order to reconcile your present to find a better future. We are competition, yes. We're living reminders for people who believed us to be one certain way, used us in that particular way, and could not win. So now what do you do with the guilt that's walking around? The guilt that's on television looking at you, the guilt that is everything you said we could not be. So I think at this point, the Black male is such a powerful symbol, and the Black family is so powerful that it still goes to a core fear. One, as some people have said, is DNA. You know, you put some brown in something else and it turns out to be light brown. So it's like, you have that DNA fear, but you also have the sense of who are these people that they can survive all that's been handed to them. And if they're that powerful, then who are we? And I'll just say this one last point. When Barack Obama became president of the United States, These reminders of the ascension that we continue to do despite and in spite of all that's happened gives us this backlash, as some people call it, the blacklash of progress. So when we have progress, there's 2 steps forward and 1 step back. So our progress is a trigger of identity. A lot of white identity is based tacitly or directly on the sense of white superiority. And as long as we continue not just to survive, but to thrive and then to excel, it triggers this idea that who am I? And until white America believes in some core point, they are human beings like everybody else. They don't have to be better. They don't have to be worse. Just be a human being. That's good enough. There's always going to be the need, as James Baldwin says, to make an N-word and to keep them in their place. And violence is one way to do that.
Let's switch to another subject, back to media. You're in a whole section of essays about the media and what they do and how we deal with the media and whatever. I think when cameras first started being omnipresent, particularly from Rodney King on, we thought that they would be a way of protecting us, one. Surely they will convict because it's on camera. We've seen all the video of them stomping the person to death, probably. He did not perish at that point. So what has happened? Why are the cameras not fixing anything? And what should the media do? Should they show less of this stuff, more of this stuff?
Well, I have a whole thing about media screen, period. But what I think happened with the repeated viewing of the violence being perpetuated, a couple of things happened. It led to a wokeness that did not exist before. It led to a whole culture saying, oh my God, this is real. These are men who are being beaten, they're being killed, this is real. What did that lead to? You had the protests. You had the flowers put at the site where the young person died. You had the sweet note stuff. After George Floyd was killed, there was worldwide protests. I mean, people in other countries were protesting. I live in Brooklyn and I overlook Flatbush Avenue. Every day for 2 weeks, there were folk marching down Flatbush Avenue one day, up Flatbush Avenue. And one day I got so caught up, I actually ran out too. And I'm walking as far as the museum and I said, wait a minute, you're the oldest person out here. Go home, you should be there too. But what that does, and this is what the danger to me in American media is, you get used to it. When I saw the bicycle riders going down Flatbush Avenue, COVID was still happening, but it was starting to end. And there was all this pent up, we gotta get out. The sun was out, people were having a good time. Most of those protesters in the early parts, right after George Floyd, were white. There were always a few Black, but for the most part, these were white folk. So you have what I call the cathartic denouement. You feel better after you've marched and ridden your bikes and protested and put down flowers and cried. You feel better. And then you forget. And America has great amnesia, great amnesia. And part of what the press does is excite folk, get us all excited, and then they go on to the next exciting thing. So you forget, and whatever that moment was of true grieving, it's gone. And Bill Maher talked about tragic porn, and that's what so much of our victimization became, tragic porn. And it's again like watching slaves being slaughtered in the Coliseum. And it's easy for America to do that, and the media feeds that.
Yes. While you're talking, could you go into the reasons you left the country and also how these cases are viewed in France?
You made
Do they
me
have-
have this in the end,
Huh?
and I appreciate.
Right,
you
do
giving
they,
me
do,
this.
do they react to these cases when they hear about them happening in the US? Too?
I can only speak to my experience in France. You know, I think Europeans really, in a lot of ways, don't get America. They really don't get that versus Castro. They don't really understand how Trump got elected. And the French know Black American history. They know our struggle and they respect it. So they like Black Americans in particular, not so much the Africans of French colonization. That's a different experience. That's a very different experience. But for the Black American, we are in our own ways heroic. The French had their own revolution. We had the Civil War, we had the Civil Rights Movement. But I think the French have always viewed Black Americans as a group of people who came out of horrific, as Gloria talked about, horrific oppression, and still created beautiful art, beautiful writing, beautiful music. We have spirit, we have style. You know, you work in the slave fields and you still sing joyful songs. So the French acknowledge that, they respect it. And I really think they don't get American racism. They just don't get it. Doesn't mean they don't have their own, but what is practiced here, I'm not sure they really get it.
Yeah. Yes, I had an opportunity to be in Paris, I guess about 3 years ago. And one of the things that impressed me was the fact that many of the Africans who are in Paris are first generation. Their parents were born in Africa, but they see themselves as French. And I traveled in Paris and in Belgium, and they really, I saw a lot of them were around the poetry scene. I was actually traveling with Sonia Sanchez, they really talked about how much they admired Black Americans and the whole hip hop movement and how they still were looking at the movements in America. They were inspired by them. But this was a different generation. These were people in their 20s and 30s. So I think that I was just amazed at how they did not really see themselves as necessarily African, but they saw themselves as French, whose parents, or Belgian, whose parents had come from Africa. And they identified with the movement as they did, as many people did with the movement. The South Africans identified with what was happening in the Civil Rights Movement. That's something you see, that it seems that sometimes, very often, the United States becomes the starting point or the place they look at for how movements happen.
Yeah, and I'm just, if you don't mind, I hope that you will have this book translated into the French.
I think it will. I don't know what translations it's gonna have, but
Because the African Americans have an oversized role globally in movements.
Yes.
And that's the other part of our power that I don't think we really get here. Because we have 13%, 15%, depending on how you look at it, of the population, we have a critical mass that's large enough. And because we are doing the things we're doing, even sitting here, in many other countries, this is really a brave act. But we take it for granted because of who we are. That's why I said, that's why if you look at everything we've been through, and then for saying, yes, and we're going to write a book about it. We're gonna set up someplace from 1754 and talk about it. So yes, this is what we do. And because many other countries, their population of African diaspora may be 3% or 5%, Canada and France and and other places. And somebody just came from last week from Italy and doing research there around the slave trade. I was in Stockholm doing research around the slave trade in Scandinavia. Those African populations are very, very small. And so they if we can find a point of Pan-Africanism. And I think the women, the mothers, may be that bridge for the other countries, for us to come together in the way of Pan-Africanism that we had over a century ago, to align and bring our voices together. Because even though they are not killing the same number over there, they are killing people of African descent in France. As a matter of fact, they had, as you know, major riots over the killing of people from Northern Africa, you know, by the police in France. And they just don't have the same number of incidents that I've seen in my travels, but definitely they are having these issues as well. And that's why they can relate to it. They have, and they will say, we've had our own George Floyd.
Yes.
You know?
But you know, no, they haven't. I'm sorry. And I don't disagree with what you're saying in terms of the difficulties they're having issues with the police. What they don't have is a culture that instinctively
That's true.
reacts to color.
Yes,
Which
that's
is what
true.
you're saying.
Yeah.
You talked about it beautifully. And what I say about being in Paris or other parts of Europe, I know that when I show up, the reaction to me is not one based on color. It could be based on height. It could be based on blood red nails, but they're not because of color.
You're an American.
Well, when they hear our voices,
Well,
I mean, I just had an incident in Florence is one of the most racist places, Florence, Italy. Every time I've gone to Florence, I've had an issue. And I'm talking about base racism. I mean, I was there for a month on writing residency, and the next door neighbor put cat feces and dog feces in front of my door. I mean, that's why I said, yes, and I have height, I have nails.
But their reaction.
And many times, you know, they are used to treating people of African descent a certain way.
Yes.
But when we open our mouths and they hear that we are Americans, the Black American in the world is respected as someone who's going to stand their ground. We are not the ones to take it. And once we say, hey, back off, it's a different story. But you can tell they're used to treating the Africans and other people as second-class citizens. I've only said bad about it, and I agree with you. They will have one incident to our 1,000. And their one incident will then, you know, recreate the riots and the things that, so I take your.
And it's also in England.
Yes.
The same thing.
Okay, but we're coming up close to an hour we've been talking. Does anybody have any burning issue that you want to bring up? Main point about your particular essay or whatever?
I just have a point about, you were asking what I would gain from other people's essays. And what really got me, and it always gets me, going back to the mothers, how these mothers had a day, and I just had and then this life-changing event happens. And my background is in activism, and as a civil rights attorney. They have to become activists. And now they're no longer known as just the mother of, or whatever they were doing before. Now, for the rest of their lives, they are in some way an activist.
Yeah.
And that was really taken by them, and then the mother theme, the ones who cried out mother, or this whole idea of mother and what the mothers now have to do because their lives have been, changed forever.
I'm sorry.
That's a good, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say that I wanted to add, I wanted to emphasize that it was really very emotionally draining, it was overpowering reading this. It's just really heavy. But I think it's also important that we talk about how we move forward and what we can do from our own personal spaces. And I ended by talking about saving our sons and setting up some strategies for making sure that we're having discussions. There's what Susan Taylor is doing with the mentoring, the mentoring cares movement, the Commission on Racial Justice. There are certain things we can do, certain organizations we can join. We have to get our churches more involved, So I think that we have to create a community, and we have to make sure that our sons and daughters feel like they're part of that community, and we have to embrace them And I always say, treat young people as if they're your own. If we all had that attitude that they are our children, they could easily be our children. I think we would have a better sense of how to embrace them and support them and listen to them. Because they have those expectations and they're going to go through things. But we have to be there and we have to model that. So we have to find ways of giving some hope and nurturing.
Yeah, the book ends on a
Yes,
really
it does.
upbeat note, with a whole chapter about healing and the things we can do, in addition to the chapter on education. So, thank you for that. Thank you. All right, the floor is open. We are ready for Q&A. Anyone? Yes.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you. I'm looking forward to taking in these days and very moved by the readings of the curriculum. Just last week, I attended the Ford Foundation, Darren Walker, a conversation we had with Cuba. And a book that day was Say Her Name, the latest book, Black Women's Stories of Police Violence and Public Silence. And I'd love to see both of you, all of you get together with her and have sort of cross conversation because yeah, that was the very beginning. What Crenshaw did was use the voices of these mothers whose daughters had been stolen by police.
Yeah.
And one of the women who spoke was there, whose daughter perished by police violence was there. It's very, but I'd love to see like maybe some way you could get together.
Yeah, I saw some discussion of that, or her talking to somebody about it. It's been a while.
Yeah, we'll start with Darren Walker, the head of Pro Foundation, just last week had her and this woman there. So I'm getting 2 weeks, two sessions. Yeah, on one hand, very painful and difficult, but on the other hand, we can talk about at the end about the mothers becoming activists and trying to gather, they bonds together and form that organization of women who lost their daughters to police violence.
Right.
So just commend that to you.
Right. We do make the point in the book that it's not something that just happens to Black men, as we all know from Breonna Taylor and some other cases, but it's not as prevalent, I think, as far as I can tell.
Well, I think that the point they were making, a lot of names that we don't know.
We don't know.
That's the question.
Right.
Still that we don't, yeah, and then you hear the list.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's also this element of mental illness. That
Yes.
So, mental illness, I mean, there's a lot of commonality. I know that, if there was, even at that event, they talked about, we don't want to sort of minimize what's happening with our Black men and teen boys.
Right.
But it's very important that I think it's important to see that they're connected with Counselor Browne-Marshall talks about our history and of violence against Black bodies. And that's something that they do too in terms of Black women. You just talked about it, but it's a continuation of that.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's very important, I think, that women speak, which is the whole point of this book. Men get to run the media, one, so our voices aren't heard that often. The few Black men who are in media do feel compelled to speak because they're the target, and I understand that. But when we have these cases of people screaming for their mothers, it makes you think, what do the mothers think? What do we as mothers think? So that's kind of the idea I want to get into. It's mothers speaking. In her case, I think there was two subjects that fit together very well. I wanted to make one other point about the book. I don't think I said was that these are not all essays where people are just emoting or giving their opinions. Because most of my best friends are journalists, there's a lot of original reporting in this book. There are statistics I have seen nowhere else that they've dug up. They've looked into some of these cases, people, you might hear about them on the news, but you don't realize how horrific they are. Like the young man who was shot within seconds. There was a man who knocked on the door of a house because his car had broken down, and the woman immediately called police as he was walking away, the police came up, he turned toward them, and they shot him immediately. And nobody knows why. In my piece, there's a man who was deaf and he was reaching for a sign to hold up that says, I can't understand you, I can't hear you. And he was shot immediately. So those are things I think, the book brings out is just actual detailed figures, data, all kinds of information about this problem. Yes.
Could the problem be that there's so many more guns in America and that's why?
I'm sure that's the bottom line. That's a
Italy.
factor.
Yeah, it's a question.
It's part of the problem is that there's so many guns in America. Yeah, certainly that's an issue.
I have a question and a comment. After I finish crying, I scream. And after I scream, I breathe. And over the past 10 or so years, I've been working with a colleague on something that she developed called a social technology called audiology. And the reason why I mention this is because we are talking about being in community. So important. And African people, indigenous, endogenous people are a community of people. We don't operate well in nuclear families. We are extended families. Extended families come into communities, communities come into cities, cities come into states, states come into countries, and so on and so forth. So in our ability to regulate ourselves and to find some kind of way to thrive and be resilient in these spaces, we have to find a way to be in community with each other. It's the only way that we're going to survive as a species of beings on this planet. But I wanted to thank you all for bringing this awareness, but also just to be able to talk about this. I'm trembling listening to the stories. It's very, very triggering for people. It's very traumatic, my heart breaks every time I hear one of these stories, but I know that the thing that makes us resilient is love and our honor and need for one another as a community. Nothing happens in isolation. Nothing happens in isolation. It's so important. And I just wanted to say that and thank you also for bringing that as part of the solution. Because it's just the balance of nature, the yin and the yang, the good and the evil. It's always going to be there, right? The rich and the poor, it's always going to be there. But the way we're able to be resilient, the resilience, and you talked about that, the resilience, that is what makes us incredibly human and perfect. So, yeah.
Thank you for that. Anybody else? What's your next book? I'm well into my next book. I don't know if I want to announce it here, but I'll tell you a little bit. I come from a family that was owned by the family that owned more slaves than anyone in the U.S. ever had or ever will. A good 10,000 souls on 45 plantations. The Hairston family, the history of that family has been written about 20 years ago. But the Hairstons have this habit of the black and white families coming together for a reunion. And we have dozens of websites on Facebook. And I was on there one night talking to a bunch of people about which plantation we came from. I said, we're the only family in North America that can have this conversation because we know where we came from, generally, which ones. And it's been documented well, and we've kept up with each other, whatever. So this white woman pops on and said, oh, I'm so-and-so, I've got, a lot of records for the family and I'd like to share them with y'all. But she's got a lot of nerves. So I talked to her online a couple more times, and then I met her at the Black-White reunion in, just before the pandemic, the summer before the pandemic. And what she's trying to do is the Harrisons, because they wrote down every baby they ever had on the plantation, and every time they gave them a blanket, who their mama was, if the daddy was known, that's in the record, and they're all in these huge ledgers at the University of Chapel Hill, North Carolina. So what she's trying to do is get them digitized, and the Mormons have agreed to do that, and get them out so people can use them already. So she wrote a blog one day about 2 years ago about how she felt when she went to go see these ledgers. Basically, she almost passed out in the library, but I messaged her and said, have you thought about doing a book about you particularly, your feelings about all this, whatever. She said, well, I'm not a writer. People keep telling me I need to write a book, And I said, well, I'm a writer. So I talked to her about what her idea was to write about her own 9 epiphanies about race in America, including learning about lynching, learning about peonage and bodily contact, including the 13th Amendment, Emmett Till, the Black Panthers, things like that. So for about 3 years, I've been interviewing someone. And we talk almost every day. Or message each other or send each other something. And I'm about 3/4 of the way through writing it. We don't have a publisher. We haven't written a proposal. I need to know that I can write this and get through it every day. And when I'm finished, then maybe I'll write a proposal. But she's already been talking about it all over the country, and I've talked about it a few places. That's my
Really interesting.
Yeah, I'd like to, if you don't mind, I said I was working on 2 books. One is a novel, historical fiction, and the other is nonfiction. And it reminds me of something, is I can trace back members of my family as well into the late 1700s. We were exodusters. And the exodusters were the first migration after slavery. So my family ancestors left the Kentucky plantation and arrived in Kansas in 1879. And the reason why they're called exodusters is because of the Exodus book of the Bible. So you know how we'll take a phrase. So they took Exodus and they made themselves exodusters. So, you know, but what I find that I'm writing about, my book, the nonfiction book that's coming out in 2025, is on protest and activism. And I expanded this concept of activism and how activism actually is in so many things that we're doing. What we're doing right now, to me, is activism. Because it's showing our agency. So activism is, you know, most people think it is just that walk up the street with the sign in the hand and the shouting and go home, where you can each take some step of activism. Each thing that we've been able to do as a people. And with our allies is when somebody says, I'm not going to just fall in line. So just going to school can be an act of activism depending on what the obstacles are. Saying something to somebody when you hear them saying racist things and they're your friends or whomever, do you say something? I even like teach my students. It's like, you know, if you have friends who are saying things that are homophobic or, you know, racist, sexist, whatever, just say, I like you, but I don't like what you're saying. It's very simple. And so my book is coming out it's titled The History of Protest. It's due out in March. But at the same time, my novel is historical fiction, which is based on enslaved women with agency. Because I feel like for us to be here today, we had to have enslaved women with agency.
Sure did.
And so we don't hear those stories. So that's what I wanted to kind of focus on for those two.
Anybody else want to pitch a book?
Yes.
I would like to plug the book that is out. American Runaway, Black and Free in Paris in the Trump years.
And it's excellent.
Yes.
Oh, thank you, teacher, thank you. And I'm proud of this book. It's my 7th book. My first book, Marie Browne, was the agent. I wish you had done American Runaway, Marie, but I know. I'm very proud of this book because it was self-published. And trying to deal with the publishing community at the point that I was doing American Runaway, nobody wanted to hear it. And I told the agent I was working with at the time, I said, if I get one more rejection letter from a young white editor that starts with, I'm so jealous that Audrey is in Paris, getting to your resentment. So I ended up, and I had 3 agents, not many rejection letters, but most of it had to do, the one agent, and it was a white agent, who liked the idea until she started reading the manuscript. And I could tell she didn't like my voice. It was too uppity. It had too much agency. And what was happening with the other editors, and I had an editor at AARP magazine, I had done a piece for her, and she, we had a good working relationship, and I called her with an idea from Paris. And she picked, and I loved her as an editor because she always picked up the phone herself. So she picked up the phone and I said, it's Audrey. And she said, Audrey, are you in Paris? I said, yes. She said, I'm in a meeting. Let me get back to you. I'm still waiting. I'm still waiting for her to get back to me. So I'm proud of the book because it was self-published. It didn't make a lot of money, but it's been the most successful book I've done in terms of acclaim. The Parisians, the French, I did a signing and a reading at the American Library in Paris.
Yes.
I did a wonderful conference with NYU in the Brandley Museum in Paris. So I really, and it's been out 3 years and it's still getting traction. Why? Because Trump is still running today. And I tell people, if that man were to go away, I would throw all of the books in the East River. I mean, if I thought that would get rid of him, it won't. So in the meantime, feel free to order from Amazon, PayPal.
What's the title again?
American Runaway, Black and Free in Paris in the Trump years.
All right, are you working on anything else?
I'm thinking about something else.
I'm working on a play. Because I began my career as a playwright before anything else. So the question in this play is, who owns American history? Who owns the American dream? And it goes to this core concept of, who does this country belong to? And that's something we keep wrestling with. Is this country a white country and the rest of us are just supposed to get the crumbs from the table? So that's what the play is about.
Brenda, you working on it?
Incubation. Now I have two projects that I have not been able to do. One is been doing interviews for years with a number of Black writers throughout the diaspora. So I've been working on putting together conversations, a book that represents conversations with Black writers. And the other is a professional memoir that, this essay could be part of. But I'm still at the point of, I'm not ready to share it with the publisher yet. Thank you.
Anybody else have a question?
Yeah, I was wondering what you all consider to be the most effective forms of protest, because I know that a lot of people my age, I guess, like I grew up at a time when I think I'm younger than a lot of people here, but like I remember when like Sandy Hook happened, and then we went back to school the next week, and there was, and I know a lot of people my age protests and post and organize and donate money and stuff for things that we deeply believe in, and then it just sort of seems like people in power do whatever they were going to do anyway. And so I wonder, I've been talking for a bit, but I'm wondering what you think are the most effective forms of protest that change policy and change people's minds?
The obvious one to me is to vote. And because, you know, not enough young people are registered to vote, not enough young people use the vote. So that's one step. The other is, you know, it really helps to lobby your congressperson. Because, you know, they figure that if they hear from one person, that then there's 10 other people that feel that way, one. And we underestimate what influence you can have, just writing them or showing up their office or whatever. That's my take.
Yeah, I would add to that, the voting is extremely important, and I get very disillusioned when I hear people say it doesn't matter. It matters so much, but also at the local level.
Yes.
So it's not just the Congress, it's the city council, it's the district leaders, it's looking at what is happening in the community and joining community organizations. You have to create win-win situations. You have to create coalitions that are continuing to work together. And you can't do this on your own. And you're talking about activism. I think, as I said, we're all activists in some way. I call myself a literary activist because I'm creating platforms for people to raise their voices, making sure that banned books are what we are including in the curriculum,
Right.
You know, or what we're including in our classroom. So they're community level, if I don't know if you're in book selling or you're an artist, there are many different kinds of coalitions, but you have to belong. You talked about community. That's the key. That's how change happens. And if you give up, nothing's gonna happen. You have to be persistent and continue even when it looks like it's not going to result in change.
I have a follow-up with that, because I'm just curious about your thoughts. When we think about activism, when we look at the protests now, what are your thoughts on how the media is portraying these young people protesting? Because I'm a community activist and I'm really proud of them. And I'm just curious, what are your thoughts on how the media, the words that the media is using to describe these young people who are really pro-life?
You know, my problem with the media in a lot of ways, it has very often no context and no sense of history. And I was struck watching the Columbia protests because, and I'm old, so 50 years ago, I was at Columbia as a student and also as someone who worked there. And Hamilton Hall was taken over, just like it's taken over recently. What didn't come out, or what has not been talked about, there's no connecting of the dots.
Right.
The press just never connects the dots. When I was at Columbia, the freshman dean was shot. He was shot by a young Black student who was never caught. The time was different. You know, Abby Hoffman was running around blowing up the butt of the statue in front of the library. So activism there's always been activism, very often led by the young people of the time, the young generation. They're energetic, they're passionate, they're optimistic, they feel that their action can lead to change. And very often it does. But I think the press likes, again, to incite the moment. You know, let's run in and show the cops, you know, scaling a ladder and going into Hamilton Hall and rounding up kids. And then the next day, they're in Palestine. And the next day, they're in Ukraine. So it's this kind of scattergun approach to supposedly reporting the news, when really what they're doing is sound bites. And let's get folk excited and move on. So I don't know I don't think the press is driving anything that's necessarily productive, because it's about ratings, about sales, it's about making money. But no, I was just gonna say, but I do agree that voting is very, very important. And I'm not gonna take a lot of time with this, but I'm so impressed with how the French protest Because they go.
Shut it down.
all in.
Shut it down.
They go all in. And I'm so glad I was not there when the subway workers went on
I
strike.
was there. Yes, I was there.
The
agriculture
workers,
They forced Macomb to stand down.
That's right.
And they've done that a couple of times. So when you talk about community, you've got to have a level of discipline. You have to be willing to see, Americans are comfortable. We don't want to suffer. So when folk, throw down the gauntlet and say, we're not working. If it takes 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, a year, we're not working. And that will force folk to change. If you can't get to work, folk will listen to what you got to say. But I think, we're not there.
I want to circle back to the question the young man put on the floor about this issue in this book and what we can do around the killing of Black people by the police. Voting does have something to do with it, but what gets missed in a lot of this, and I've written essays about it previously, the prosecutors decide whether or not they're going to prosecute the police. The protests have to have a focus, a goal. It's what happens so often, whether or not, and I use the trifecta of litigation, legislation, protest, there's got to be a vision for what we want to change. It's not, we want them to stop killing, but there's got to be, and it was in many instances in the previous protests of other generations, we know what it is we want. We want to be able to buy clothes in this store without doing these things. We want to be able to register to vote. Therefore, we're going to focus our protests on the registrar. We're going to focus on bringing attention to the issue. The prosecutors fail to do their job, and just day after day after day. Over 1,000 people die at the hands of police every year. You can go to the Washington Post, that's one of the essays too, but it's also one of the things I've said for many years. The Washington Post keeps a record of everyone killed by police, not the FBI. The FBI's records are not as good as the Washington Post. So you can go to the Washington Post right now, go online, and it will tell you the name, the age, and how somebody was killed and where they were killed. And so if the Washington Post knows this, the prosecutors know it. But there's no indictment. There are no charges because the prosecutor chooses not to indict or chooses not to bring the evidence to the grand jury to lead to an indictment. And that's where we need to target the protest for it to be effective. Because what happens, people will protest for a little while. Oh, nothing happened. Protest doesn't work. Protest does work if it's targeted to get the change that's needed. You could get that change. Right now, we have a George Floyd bill that's been languishing in Congress that is supposed to reform criminal justice. We need to protest targeting the passage of that bill. So when we vote, the vote is targeted saying, if you're not going to work on passing this, you are not going to be in office as far as I'm concerned. So until we start making our demands and the protest is targeted toward making very clear change, then it's a scattershot of, I'm burnt out on protest, it's not working, and just sit down. We need to make sure those people in office, we're protesting, they're not doing what they're supposed to do. We pay their salaries. If you look at your pay stub, that state, local, and federal tax taken out is paying their salary. So these things that you would do as an activist, as a community activist, is targeting those changes. But people rarely think of the prosecutor when it comes to police shootings and killings. They rarely think about it. You've got to think about it. That prosecutor makes the difference between that officer just saying, I fear for my life and walking away and still being able to either work in that precinct or another. Just think, there are 18,000 police jurisdictions in this country. Each one of them has a prosecutor's office. We need to really, on the ground, spread that news using social media that young people love so much. Use that social media to get people across the country to protest focused on their prosecutor's office, because most people don't know, and the prosecutors know you don't know it. And that's why they're not going to change what they're doing, which is, if this was a civilian on civilian crime, they would know exactly what to do. But when it's law enforcement and the police involved killing of a civilian, they pretend to be stupid.
I was just gonna say, the Washington Post started keeping data after Michael Brown died. They realized that nobody else had any data. So they've been tracking every case since then. The FBI kind of has a system, but no police department is required to report shootings of civilians.
Wow.
Yeah, and one of the things that I put forward as a solution, not in this piece, but I put forward previously, is that prosecutors be required to report a police shooting to the Justice Department. Because I was on a show on Bloomberg News, and they said, you know, so what do you think should happen? Thank you for asking. And because the prosecutors work hand in glove with police departments.
That's right.
So any shooting that takes place, the prosecutors know about it. And they should be able to then send that information to the Department of Justice under penalty of perjury.
Yes.
And right now, even if prosecutors lie, fail to do whatever, they don't lose their license. They still get their pensions. They're still a part of the community. So nothing is happening to the officer, nothing is happening to the police, to the prosecutors. If that is the target of the protest, I think it would be highly effective.
Change everything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I just want to go to, because what you said is so correct. What happened in France? What were the strikers striking, the transit workers striking over? Macron wanted to lower the retirement age. That was the single focus. And what made it so incredible, and this happens all the time when folk go out on strike, the Opera House went out in support. The school teachers, some went out in support. So whenever the workers strike in Paris, other workers in community go out in support. And when you have that kind of organization and that kind of focus, it's very effective.
And the powers that be understand economic pain.
Yeah.
So.
Right, and I think, you know, just, I don't wanna get into politics, but if we look at the protests now, around Palestine, I think if it were more specifically focused, they would have more leverage. They would have given themselves more leverage. But it's very easy, if you don't have a specific focal point, it's very easy for the powers that be to just knock down everything. So you have to be very strategic about what you're asking for.
And I hope that you send information about this book to politicians. Because they are
to my congresswoman already.
Yes, I mean, even if we just send the information about the book to the politicians, because they need the talking points. They're not going to delve deeply like the media into these issues, but they will have these talking points to use in order to effectively work with their colleagues on creating the legislation or passing the legislation needed to save lives. And that's what this is about. It is not just about speaking of the lives lost and the pain caused. I hope and I pray it's also about saving lives.
Yes. That's the last piece I wrote, save our children, save our sons, save, that's the ultimate goal.
Yeah, Brenda has a beautiful poem that her essay ends with about saving our sons.
Are you gonna read it? I can read it.
Do we have time?
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead. Then I send it.
Okay. This is for the beloved community. They are your sons too, dedicated to those who work with our sons. They are part of the village, the community, the nation. They are your sons too. Treat them as you do your own sons. Give them peace of mind. They are your sons too. Those who struggle to learn, those who want to sing, to dance, to act, those who bully, who fight, who cry, those who play ball, who run track, who box, they are your sons too. Treat them as though they were part of you. Nurture them, talk to them, give them hope, inspire their creativity, foster their genius, stir their imagination, surround them with love, create lasting memories. They are your sons too. Hear their cries for help. Listen to their stories and music. Listen to their words and lyrics. Talk and conversate with them. Celebrate with them, work with them, discuss, discuss, discuss. Give of yourselves. They are your sons too. Create a safe place, a peaceful place for our sons.